Hi. So today I want to talk about my top 5 most exciting remote sensing technologies that I think are kind of either already developed but haven't been properly tested, or are, in the pipeline for the next 5 years or so. These are all remote sensing technologies for forestry. And, another way of thinking about this video is if I were going to redo my PhD, or if I weren't being a drama queen about the carbon world, what kind of research stuff would I want to be working on? Number 1, let me talk about stereo satellite imagery. So satellite imagery has, it's exploded in recent years. There's a bunch of companies that basically offer very high resolution satellite imagery from space. Planet, Maxar, Airbus, I would say, are the 3 big players right now. They offer very high resolution stuff. I mean, you can get like 30 centimeter stuff. Maxar is even starting to like inch out like 20 and 15 centimeter satellite images. So, does this excite me? Well, not really. 2D satellite imagery, as far as I'm concerned, is not quite what we need to actually estimate forest carbon. You can do a lot of stuff with it, but it's pretty expensive. So it not only needs to be able to justify itself and in doing so basically estimate forest carbon, it needs to be accurate, right? I've done a bunch of work with the data myself. I have not been convinced that 2D satellite imagery alone is enough to estimate forest carbon to the degree of accuracy that we would need to really issue carbon credits. One of the problems, I think, is that with high-resolution 2D satellite imagery, you still end up with models that kind of oversaturate. So they're not really good at predicting biomass or height in really high biomass or really tall forests. I think there's a lot of room for arguments in this. And I think that a certain very prolific remote sensing scientist at Planet is probably going to have some comments on this video. I don't see many peer-reviewed journal articles proving that 2D satellite imagery can really get you accurate biomass estimations. Maybe there's a few out there. It's not a technology that's been adopted by the timber industry, for example, to make their inventories, right? The timber industry still flies LiDAR. 2D imagery, it's been around for decades, right? Like, we've been capturing high-resolution 2D imagery from airplanes for just 50 to 70 years. Taking it from space is great, but it doesn't necessarily make the data any more useful for actually estimating forest carbon stock. That said, I think that there are some philosophical reasons why 2D imagery could be useful for estimating forest carbon. For one thing, we do know that the shapes and sizes of tree crowns are correlated with the amount of carbon that a tree stores. This just makes sense, right? Now, the greenness may not be, but if you have high enough resolution imagery to actually make out the shapes and sizes of tree crowns, there is a biological reason for why this might be an accurate approach to estimating carbon. You could argue that with newer technologies like neural networks that are able to scan the images and actually measure the shapes and sizes of tree crowns, you could create a model that was presumably as accurate as LiDAR at estimating carbon. I haven't seen anyone really do that yet, to my satisfaction. So I'm setting 2D imagery aside here. I do not get that excited about it. Rarely is it worth the cost of purchasing that imagery. What does get me excited? Stereo imagery is what gets me excited. Now, this is imagery taken from multiple angles from space. And this really piques my interest because you can use basically like triangulation photogrammetry techniques to reconstruct the heights of trees. I think this is really understudied. A lot of people have been doing this with drones for a long time, and they've been tremendously successful. But again, drones only are like limited to the little areas. If this can be done from space on a regular basis with a very, productized approach, we could be creating forest height maps for the entire Earth very accurately. There are already a couple of products out there that excite me. Maxar puts out a 50 centimeter resolution height map. Now, it's not a height map of trees, it's a surface model, so it doesn't actually tell you how high the trees are, it just tells you how high everything is off sea level. So, if the ground is 30 meters above sea level and the trees are another 20 meters above sea level, you'll just get a number of 50. You don't actually know how tall the trees are. So that's another step of the processing that needs to be done. I don't think this technology is quite there yet. I think it's almost there. So this is why I would love to be working with it, because nobody really sells this imagery and, makes it easy to use. It's very difficult to do these 3D reconstructions. It doesn't need to be. It's much easier to do with a drone than it is with stereo satellite data. In the past, I've purchased stereo satellite data from these companies, and I've been a little bit underwhelmed because they kind of just dump a couple of images on you and expect you to be able to intuit tree heights from that. There's a couple of free tools like NASA AIM Stereo Pipeline, genuinely a nightmare to work with. Really, what I would like to see being offered by Planet, Maxar, and Airbus are a set of standardized processes for computing height maps, from stereo satellite imagery. And none of them really do that on like a great scale. So that's why this field excites me, is because the data is already out there. It's being collected right now. It could, in theory, be used to estimate three-dimensional, forest tree height and stuff. It's just not quite being used yet. And I think a lot of scientists out there have been really hesitant to shell out money to buy this data, right? That's another question that people ask is why aren't scientists already testing these methods if they're already in orbit, right? The answer to that is that they cost a lot of money. A science lab can't necessarily afford $20,000 in data. And the other answer to that is that oftentimes scientists get their funding through like NSF grants or government grants. And if you're applying to a NASA grant, you basically have to say how you're going to use NASA data. And so you can't apply for a NASA grant and then say you're going to use planet imagery for your work. So that's been, I think, a little bit prohibitive on why, stereo satellite imagery hasn't taken off as much in the field as I would like. The second technology out there that really excites me is P-band radar. Now, P-band radar is a type of radar with really long radio waves that can penetrate down into the forest and come back and tell you exactly how tall the forest is and how complex the vegetation is. There is no P-band radar satellite in orbit or on aircraft right now, right? This is a technology that really doesn't exist yet. But next year, the European Space Agency is going to launch a P-band radar satellite, and it's going to be the first of its kind. Traditionally, P-band radar has been very difficult to capture. It requires a really large satellite array, and it's also, it's kind of only good for forests. So, you don't have like the DoD commissioning satellites for P-band radar generally, at least not as far as I'm aware. So this is really exciting. The satellite is called Biomass, which is just the worst name on Earth for a satellite, but the ESA's Biomass mission has me the most excited out of absolutely all technologies. They've flown a couple of experimental flights so far with P-band radar from a commercial airplane. And the images that they get back from that are just mesmerizing because they look like biomass maps without doing anything to them at all. You can just look at the coloration schemes and you can just see where the forests are taller and where the forests are shorter. It's almost like having LiDAR. It could very well be that 2 years from now, after biomass is launched, all of our forest mapping problems will be solved. I suspect the data will be a little bit more challenging to work with than that, but there is room for hope on the horizon. So biomass gets me excited. What doesn't get me excited about the radar scene out there is a new NASA satellite called NISAR. And NISAR, it's not P-band, it's L-band radar. And people in this field get very excited about this upcoming satellite mission. I don't understand the hype because there's already L-band radar satellites in orbit. There's an Argentine one that's fantastic called SALCOM. Nobody uses it. L-band radar, it's really good, but it still saturates in really high biomass situations. So it's not always going to be ideal for estimating biomass, and it might not get you to the levels of uncertainty that you'd really want for inventorying your forest. I'm going to skip over the NISAR hype and go straight to the biomass hype. So that covers kind of the large footprint radar, the stuff that's going to be like 20 to 30 meters in resolution that's coming out soon. But there's another type of radar out there that already exists today that gets me very excited. And I'm talking about super high resolution radar taken from space. There's a couple of companies out there today like URSA and ISI that are, and again, I think Airbus, that are offering really, really high resolution radar data sets. Now, the type of radar that they're using has traditionally been discarded by forest scientists. So it basically just bounces right off the surface of the canopy. It doesn't tell you how tall the trees are. It kind of just tells you whether or not there are trees. So, you can use this radar to kind of monitor for deforestation, but you can't really use it to actually estimate carbon. Here's what gets me excited about the super high resolution stuff. Instead of looking at the forest with like a 10-meter resolution and just saying, oh, there's trees here, not trees there, we can start looking at the forest at a 25-centimeter resolution. And when you apply this radar at such a high resolution, then you're actually getting really detailed information about the shapes and sizes of each and every tree crown. You get shadowing effects that basically tell you how tall the trees are. So I think there's a lot of information in this data that could be mined, by the right grad student or by the right researcher that isn't necessarily being used today. Once again, this is very expensive data. It's not being necessarily investigated properly by academia, but I would really love to see, some people experiment with it. The next data set that I want to talk about is hyperspectral imagery. Now, I've talked about this previously before. Hyperspectral imagery is really cool because instead of just imaging like a couple of bands of light, so typically when you take a picture with your cell phone, you're imaging maybe 3 bands of light. Hyperspectral imagery is capable of seeing 1,000 different colors of light. And taking the nuances of 1,000 different colors of a tree can tell you so much about the ecosystem. It can tell you about the health of the tree. It can tell you about the specific nutrient content of the tree or of the ecosystem. It can tell you what species the tree is. All the trees may look green to us, but they all have very subtle different colorations. It can tell you about biodiversity. And potentially, it can tell you about how much carbon there is too, although that science is a little bit less demonstrated. So hyperspectral imagery is really cool. Up until now, it's been pretty much cost prohibitive. You kind of have to fly it with a drone or have to pay a ton of money for an airplane. Most people are not willing to do this at scale for this kind of information. But there's a couple of hyperspectral satellites that are being placed into orbit that really excite me. One of them is from a company called Pixel. They've just launched their satellites, and they're going to be able to produce 5-meter resolution hyperspectral, imagery across the entire globe. Another one I think that's out there is there's some stuff by the German Space Agency. There's some stuff from a company called Spire. These are all new satellites. I mean, this type of hyperspectral imagery hasn't been available in space, or was only available in space in very limited experimental conditions. I would love to see this data be cheaply and widely available, and love to see what the ecosystem physiologists can do with it. I'm curious to see whether or not it could be used to actually estimate forest carbon as well. But it can certainly tease apart a lot of these ecosystem services that are so crucial to forest carbon projects. The last technology that I want to talk about is called single photon LiDAR. And this has kind of been floating around out there for a while. It excites me personally because it's a new type of LiDAR. It's a relatively new type of LiDAR that can be that's much more efficient than the older technologies. Now, the technology isn't worked out perfectly. The LiDAR point clouds are maybe not as good. They're very noisy compared to traditional LiDAR, but they are 10 to 20 times more efficient. You can even imagine a scenario where the governments of major countries are commissioning companies to fly single photon LiDAR over the entire world or parts of countries very quickly. I heard a rumor out there, which is probably not true, that the entire nation of Afghanistan was flown in a matter of weeks using a single photon LiDAR when the US was still there. And it sounds plausible to me because you can fly at 20,000 feet and get a massive footprint. It can also be launched into space. There is a single photon LiDAR satellite in space right now. It has kind of outdated technology. It's not as good as we can do, but I'm really excited for the next generation of single photon LiDAR sensors. Here's a spicy take. Artificial intelligence and deep learning. Right? How on earth can artificial intelligence and deep learning be underrated? Well, I really do feel it is underrated in this space. And here's the reason why. Most of us, well, all of us who are using deep learning in this space right now are not really using the absolute most cutting edge stuff. And I'm serious. Every single company, every single academic, myself included, we're not using the most cutting edge deep learning algorithms. And most of us are using UNets, ResNets, Inception. We're kind of using algorithms that date to 2017. And these are really good at interpreting satellite imagery or interpreting LiDAR and making really good estimates of whatever it is you're trying to make an estimate, biomass or whatever it happens to be, forest cover. And that's much better than the traditional statistical modeling that we've been doing. But here's the thing. there's so much more to artificial intelligence than just, making a slightly better model than a regression equation. Because people are just doing so many cool things with this in other spaces outside of remote sensing. So let me give an example. GANs, generative adversarial neural networks. They are really cool. They're able to basically generate their own data, and you can feed in an image, for example, and produce another image that's been tinkered with. So people use GANs, for example, to feed in an image of a young person and create an image of an older one. People are using GANs in Hollywood to create monsters, like Thanos. I'm pretty sure he's a GAN. Well, think of the applications for remote sensing. Think of if you could, for example, feed in a LiDAR data set from 10 years ago and have it produce a LiDAR data set where the trees have grown. You could create a model that's able to forecast growth, just based on satellite imagery. And you could train this model by basically just using a bunch of before and after satellite shots. So, all right, that's really cool. Let's move on to another example. In the self-driving car industry, people are using artificial intelligence to basically scan 2D images and create 3D depth maps. So they're basically kind of doing this with inference. Sometimes they have images from multiple angles, but this is really cool because imagine if you took a satellite image or a couple of satellite images and used that to create a depth map that showed the height of the trees. That would be just revolutionary. You could create wall-to-wall global height maps. All right, I'm not done yet though. There's a bunch of really advanced neural networks that are able to basically look at videos, look at video scenes and then forecast what the next scene is going to be. So you feed in a bunch of video images of a person walking across the street. It'll spit out images of the person continuing to walk across the street and then the cars going by and stuff. That's really cool. How could we be using that for remote sensing? Imagine if we used that kind of technology for baseline analysis. Imagine if we used that kind of technology to forecast what forests are going to do in the future. Imagine feeding in satellite imagery from 1984 to 2022 and asking it to predict what the forests are going to do up until 2030 or 2040. It seems completely plausible. It even seems like an easier scenario than what's being done right now in other fields. One more here. GPT-3 is arguably the most advanced, artificial intelligence algorithm out there right now. It's been designed by basically feeding in almost the entire internet into this neural network and having it kind of predict what was going to happen next. You feed in a set of text, Adolf Hitler was blank, blah, 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 and it'll predict what, it'll fill in what's next. Hopefully it says not so great, but you never really know with these algorithms. Well, all right, so that's really cool. How could we be using that for remote sensing? Imagine training a model like this on all the satellite data that exists out there today. There are petabytes of satellite data that's public in the open domain. Imagine training a model like GPT-3 to predict satellite imagery from satellite imagery. All right, what does that actually do for us? Well, take for example, if you wanted to remove clouds or if you had a bunch of haze in your image, you could feed in a hazy image, have it produce a non-hazy image. This is basically using kind of style transfer techniques. You could also just retrain this model very easily to predict all kinds of cool stuff about that satellite data. I think what's really key about these really massive models like GPT-3 is that they are learning massive amounts of contextual data, and you could imagine doing the same thing. You could imagine the model being smart enough to know, okay, I'm looking at a South Carolina loblolly pine plantation that was planted 30 years ago, therefore there's this much biomass. That's kind of the intuition that kind of goes on behind the scenes in these really deep neural networks. All right, so that's what gets me excited about deep learning and AI. Again, why does this not exist in the field right now? Well, like I said, we're using kind of older neural network techniques from 5 years in the past, and that makes sense, right? All the stuff that I've talked about, it's very research grade stuff, and it costs tens of millions of dollars for Google and OpenAI and stuff to actually train these models. You need supercomputers, you need teams and teams of people. And that's because they're on the cutting edge, right? They needed supercomputers and teams of people to train the models that we're working with now 5 years ago. And so, in an industry like ours where the science is very applied, where we really just need our biomass map, there isn't quite the same impetus to invest in that level of really research and moonshot type modeling. Nonetheless, I really look forward to 5 years from now when these models become, easily trainable on a single GPU or two, and we can then start like playing around with these things. So, if I were working on my PhD again, if I had time to do more like fundamental research, this is definitely the areas where I'd be focused. I really look forward to the day in which we're able to know almost everything about the world's forests remotely. I think we're not too far away from that. I also think that we could get to the point where we're using this technology on a very high frequency basis to know exactly how much carbon the world's forests are storing.